The history of video game consoles, both home and handheld, began in the 1970s. The first console that played games on a television set was the 1972 Magnavox Odyssey. Handheld consoles originated from electromechanical games. These used mechanical controls and light-emitting diodes, or LEDs, as visual indicators. Handheld electronic games had replaced the mechanical controls with electric and digital components, and with the introduction of liquid crystal display, or LCDs, used to create video-like screens with programmable pixels. Systems like the Microvision and the Game & Watch became the first handheld video game consoles. Since then, home game consoles have progressed through technology cycles typically referred to as generations. Each generation has lasted approximately 5 years, during which the major console manufacturers have released consoles with broadly similar specifications. Handheld consoles have seen similar advances and are usually grouped into the same generations as home consoles. As of the recording of this episode, there are currently 9 generations of video game consoles, starting with first generation, which ran from 1972 to 1983.
This is Odyssey, the new electronic game simulator. You attach Odyssey to your television set in seconds to create a closed-circuit electronic playground. Odyssey is tennis, roulette, football and hockey, analogic, and geography. Odyssey comes complete with 12 electronic games and educational experiences. Many more are optionally available, like a shooting gallery, a prehistoric safari. Odyssey is an electronic teacher. Odyssey is a total play and learning experience for all ages. Odyssey. It's new from Magnavox. Odyssey.
The first generation of home consoles were generally limited to dedicated consoles with just 1 or 2 games pre-built into the console hardware, with a limited means to alter gameplay factors. In the case of the Odyssey, while it did ship with game cards, these did not have any programmed games on them, but instead acted as jumpers to alter the existing circuitry pathway and did not extend the capabilities of the console. Unlike most other future console generations, the first generation of consoles were typically built in limited runs rather than as an ongoing product line. Coleco developed the first Telstar console in 1976. With Magnavox, Atari, and Coleco all vying in the console space by 1976 and further cost reductions in key processing chips from General Instruments, numerous third-party manufacturers entered the console market by 1977 with ball and paddle games. This led to market saturation by 1977 and the industry's first market crash. Atari and Coleco attempted to make dedicated consoles with wholly new games to remain competitive, including Atari's Video Pinball series and Coleco's Telstar Arcade. But by this point, the first steps of the market's transition to the second generation of consoles had begun, making these units obsolete near release. Moving on to the next generation, which lasted from 1976 to 1992, the second generation of home consoles was distinguished by the introduction of the game cartridge, where the game's code is stored in read-only memory, otherwise known as ROM, within the cartridge. When the cartridge is slotted into the console, the electrical connections allow for the main console's processors to read the game's code from the ROM. While ROM cartridges had been used in other computer applications prior, the ROM game cartridge was first implemented in the Fairchild Video Entertainment System in November 1976, otherwise known as the Fairchild Channel F. Additional consoles during this generation, which all used cartridge-based systems, included the Atari 2600, known as the Atari Video Computer System at launch, the Magnavox Odyssey 2, Mattel Electronics and Television, and the ColecoVision. Handheld electronic games had already been introduced on the market, such as Mattel Auto Race in 1977 and Simon in 1978. While not considered video games as lacking the typical video game screen element, instead using LED lights as game indicators, they still established a market for portable video games. The first handheld game console emerged during the second home console generation, using simple LC displays. Early attempts at cartridge-based handheld systems included the Microvision by Milton Bradley and the Epoch Game Pocket Computer, but neither gained significant traction. Nintendo, on the other hand, introduced its line of Game & Watch portable games, each with a single dedicated game as its first venture into the video game market. First introduced in 1980, the Game & Watch series ran over a decade and sold more than 40 million units. Frequently referred to as the 8-bit generation, the third generation, which lasted from 1983 to 2003, had consoles that used 8-bit processors, 5 audio channels, and more advanced graphics capabilities including sprites and tiles instead of block-based graphics of the second generation. Both the Sega SG-1000 and the Nintendo Famicom, short for Family Computer, launched simultaneously in Japan in 1983. The Famicom, after some initial technical recalls, soon gained traction and became the best-selling console in Japan by the end of 1984. By that point, Nintendo wanted to bring the Famicom to North America, but recognized the faults that the video game crash had caused. It took several steps to redesign the console to make it look less like a video game console and rebranded it as the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES, for the North American market to avoid the video game label stigma. The company also wanted to avoid the loss of publishing control that had occurred in both North America as well as Asia after the release of the Famicom, and created a lockout system that required all game cartridges to be manufactured by Nintendo to include a special chip. If this chip was not present, the console would fail to play the game. This further gave Nintendo direct control on the titles published for the system, rejecting those it felt were too mature. The NES launched in North America in 1985 and helped to revitalize the video game market there. Another company, Sega, attempted to compete with the NES with its own console, the Master System, released later in 1986 in both Japan and the US, but did not gain traction to compete. Similarly, Atari's attempts to compete with the console via the 7800 in 1987 failed to knock out the NES from its dominant position. The NES remained in production until 2003, when it was discontinued along with its successor, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. The fourth generation of video game consoles, lasting from 1987 to 2004, and also known as the 16-bit generation, further advanced core console technology with 16-bit processors, improving the available graphics and audio capabilities of games. Next, TurboGrafx 16, or PC Engine as released in Japan and first released in 1987, is considered the first fourth-generation console, even though it still had an 8-bit CPU. The console's 16-bit graphics processor gave it capabilities comparable to that of other fourth-generation systems, and Next marketing had pushed the console being an advancement over the NES as a 16-bit system. Both Sega and Nintendo entered the fourth generation with true 16-bit systems, with the 1989 release of the Sega Genesis, or Mega Drive in Japan, and the 1991 Super Nintendo Entertainment System, otherwise known as SNES and Super Famicom in Japan. SNK also entered the competition with a modified version of their Neo Geo MVS arcade system into the Neo Geo, released in 1990, which attempted to bridge the gap between arcade and home console systems with a shared use of common game cartridges and memory cards. This generation was also notable for the so-called console wars between Nintendo and Sega, primarily taking place in North America. Sega, to try to challenge Nintendo's dominant position, created the mascot character Sonic the Hedgehog, who exhibited a cool personality to appeal to the Western youth in contrast to Nintendo's Mario, and bundled the Genesis with a game of the same name. The strategy succeeded, with Sega becoming the dominant player in North America until the mid-1990s. Console manufacturers adapted by created hardware add-ons to their consoles that could read and play CD-ROMs, including Next TurboGrafx CD add-on, as well as the integrated Turbo Duo system in 1988, the Sega CD add-on for the Genesis in 1991, and the Neo Geo CD in 1994. Costs of these add-ons were generally high, nearing the same price as the console itself, and with the introduction of disc-based consoles in the fifth generation starting in 1993, these fell by the wayside. Nintendo had initially worked with Sony to develop a similar add-on for the Super Nintendo, known as the Super NES CD-ROM, but just before its introduction, business relationships between Nintendo and Sony broke down, and Sony would take its idea on to develop the fifth generation PlayStation. Additionally, Philips intended to enter the market with a dedicated CD-ROM format, the CDI, also released in 1990, that included other uses for the CD-ROM media beyond video games. However, the console never gained traction. The 4th generation had a long tail that overlapped with the 5th generation, with the Super Nintendo's discontinuation in 2003 marking the end of said generation. To keep their console competitive with the new 5th generation ones, Nintendo took to the use of coprocessors manufactured into the game cartridges to enhance the capabilities of the Super Nintendo. This included the Super FX chip, which was first used in the game Star Fox in 1993, generally considered one of the first games to use real-time polygon-based 3D rendering on consoles. The 5th generation of video game consoles, lasting from 1993 to 2006, home computers gained greater prominence as a way of playing video games. The video game console industry nonetheless continued to thrive alongside home computers due to the advantages of much lower prices, easier portability, circuitry specifically dedicated toward video games, the ability to be played on a television set, which PCs of the time could not do in most cases, and intensive first-party software support from manufacturers who were essentially banking their entire future onto their consoles. Besides the shift to 32-bit processors, the 5th generation of consoles also saw most companies, excluding Nintendo, shift to dedicated optical media formats instead of game cartridges, given their lower cost of production and higher storage capacity. Initial consoles of the 5th generation attempted to capitalize on the potential power of CD-ROMs, which included the 3DO and the Atari Jaguar in 1993. However, early in the cycle, these systems were far more expensive than existing 4th generation models and had much smaller game libraries. Furthermore, Nintendo's use of coprocessors in late Super Nintendo games further kept that console as one of the best-selling systems over new 5th generation ones. Two of the key consoles of the 5th generation were introduced, the Sega Saturn and the Sony PlayStation, both of which challenged the Super Nintendo's ongoing dominance. While the Saturn sold well, it did have a number of technical flaws, but established Sega for a number of key game series going forward. The PlayStation, in addition to using optical media, also introduced the use of memory cards to save the state of a game. Though memory cards had been used by Neo Geo to allow players to transfer game information between home and arcade systems, the PlayStation's approach allowed games to have much more longer gameplay and narrative elements, leading to highly successful role-playing games like Final Fantasy VII. By 1996, the PlayStation became the best-selling console. Nintendo released their next console, the Nintendo 64, in late 1996. Unlike other 5th generation units, it still used game cartridges, as Nintendo believed the load time advantages of cartridges over CD-ROMs was still essential, as well as their ability to continue to use lockout mechanisms to protect copyrights. The system also included support for memory cards as well, and Nintendo developed a strong library of first-party titles for the game system, including Wave Race 64 and The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, which helped to drive its sales. While the Nintendo 64 did not match the PlayStation's sales, it did keep Nintendo a key competitor in the home console market alongside Sony and Sega. As with the transition from the 4th to 5th generation, the 5th generation has a long overlap with the 6th console generation, with the PlayStation remaining in production until 2006. Lasting from 1998 to 2013, by the 6th generation, console technology began to catch up to performance of personal computers at the time, and the use of bits as their overall selling point fell by the wayside. The console manufacturers focused on the individual strengths of their game libraries as marketing tools instead. The consoles of the 6th generation saw further adoption of optical media, expanding into the DVD format for even greater data storage capacity, additional internal storage solutions to function as memory cards, as well as adding support either directly or through add-ons to connect to the internet for online gameplay. Consoles began to move towards a convergence of features of other electronic living room devices and moving away from single-feature systems. By this point, there were only 3 major players in the market: Sega, Sony, and Nintendo. Sega got an early lead with the Dreamcast, first released in Japan in 1998. It was the first home console to include a modem to allow players to connect to the Sega network and play online games. However, Sega found several technical issues that had to be resolved before its Western launch in 1999. Though its Western release was more successful than in Japan, the console was soon outperformed by Sony's PlayStation 2, released in 2000. The PlayStation 2 was the first console to add support for DVD playback in addition to CD-ROM, as well as maintaining backward compatibility with games from the PlayStation library, which helped to draw consumers in that remained on the long tail of the original PlayStation.
I've been waiting for a while because I read PlayStation magazines. I mean, I heard the concept of it. Then it said, check your local video game store, see if you can reserve yours. Just having an arcade inside your room, maybe even better than arcade graphics in your room.
And give us PlayStation, would you?
While other consoles of the 6th generation had not anticipated this step, the Sony PlayStation 2's introduction of backwards compatibility became a major design consideration of future generations. Along with a strong game library, the PlayStation 2 went on to sell 155 million units before it was discontinued in 2013, and as of 2020 remains the best-selling home console of all time. Unable to compete with Sony, Sega discontinued the Dreamcast in 2001 and left the hardware market, instead focusing on its software properties. Nintendo's entry into the 6th generation was the GameCube in 2001, its first system to use optical discs based on the mini DVD format. A special Game Boy player attachment allowed the GameCube to use any of the Game Boy cartridges as well, and adapters were made available to allow the console to connect to the internet via broadband or modem. At this point, Microsoft had also entered the console market with its first Xbox system, released in 2001. Microsoft had considered the PlayStation 2's success as a threat to the personal computer in the living room space, and had developed the Xbox to compete. As such, the Xbox was designed based more on Microsoft's experience from personal computers, using an operating system built out of its Microsoft Windows and DirectX features, utilizing a hard disk for Save Game Store, built-in Ethernet functionality, and created the first console online service, Xbox Live, to support multiplayer games. While the original Xbox had modest sales compared to the PlayStation 2 and was not profitable for the company, Microsoft considered the Xbox to have successfully demonstrated their abilities to participate in the console market. The 7th generation of video game consoles, lasting from 2005 to 2017, video game consoles had become an important part of the global IT infrastructure by the mid-2000s. It was estimated that video game consoles represented 25% of the world's general-purpose computational power in the year 2007. By the 7th generation, Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo all had developed consoles designed to interface with the internet, adding networking support for either wired or wireless connections, online services to support multiplayer games, digital storefronts for digital purchases of games, and both internal storage and support for external storage on the console for these games. With the start and transition to the HD era, these consoles had also added support for digital television resolutions through HDMI interfaces, but as the generation occurred in the midst of the high-definition optical disc format war between Blu-ray and HD DVD, a standard for high-definition playback was yet to be fixed. A further innovation came by the use of motion controllers, either built into the console or offered as an add-on afterwards. Consoles in this generation started using custom CPUs based on the PowerPC instruction set, and were increasingly sharing similarities with the personal computer in-game development, although these challenges were due to the more complex nature of porting between the differences in architectures. Sony's PlayStation 3 was released in 2006. The PlayStation 3 represented a shift of the internal hardware from Sony's custom Emotion engine to a PowerPC-based system. Initial PlayStation 3 units shipped with a special Emotion engine daughter board that allowed for backwards compatibility of PlayStation 2 games, but later revisions of the unit removed this, leaving only software-based emulation for PlayStation games available. Sony banked on the Blu-ray format, which was included from the start, and partially helped spur the adoption of Blu-ray as the favored format of high-definition optical media. With the PlayStation 3, Sony introduced the PlayStation Network for its online services and storefront. While the system would initially have a slow start in the market in part due to its high price, complex game development environment, and initial lack of quality games, the PlayStation 3 eventually became more well received over time following gradual price cuts, improved marketing campaigns, new hardware revisions, particularly the Slim mods, and key critically acclaimed exclusives. Nintendo introduced the Wii in 2006, around the same time as the PlayStation 3. Nintendo lacked the same manufacturing capabilities and relationships with major hardware supplies as Sony and Microsoft, and to compete, diverged on a feature-for-feature approach and instead developed the Wii around the novel use of motion controls in the Wii Remote. This blue ocean strategy, releasing a product where there was no competition, was considered part of the unit's success, and which drove Microsoft and Sony to develop their own motion control accessories to compete. The 8th generation, lasting from 2012 to 2020, consoles focused on further integration with other media and increased connectivity. Consoles at this point had also standardized on CPUs using the x86 instruction set, the same as in personal computers, and there was a convergence of the individual hardware components between consoles and personal computers, making the porting of games between these systems much easier. The Wii U, introduced in 2012, was considered by Nintendo to be a successor to the Wii, but geared to more serious players. The console supported backward compatibility with the Wii, including its motion controls, and introduced the Wii U Gamepad, a tablet controller hybrid that acted as a second screen. Nintendo further refined its network offerings to develop the Nintendo Network service to combine storefront and online connectivity services. The Wii U did not sell as well as Nintendo had planned, as they found people mistook the gamepad to be a tablet that they could take with them away from the console, and the console struggled to draw in third-party developers as the Wii had. Both the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One came out in 2013. Both were similar improvements over the previous generation's respective consoles, providing more computational power to support up to 60 frames per second at 1080p resolutions for some games. Each unit also saw a similar set of revisions and repackaging to develop high and low-end cost versions. In the case of the Xbox One, the console's initial launch had included the Kinect device, but this became highly controversial in terms of potential privacy violations and lack of developer support, and by its mid-generation refresh, the Kinect had been dropped and discontinued as a game device. Both consoles eventually released upgraded hardware during their mid-cycle refresh, with Sony releasing the PlayStation 4 Pro and Microsoft releasing the Xbox One X, which allowed for higher frame rates and up to 4K resolution, in addition to slim models, marking a departure from previous generations while adding considerable longevity to this generation cycle. The Nintendo Switch is a hybrid console capable of both being used as a home console in its docked mode and as a handheld. The Nintendo Switch Lite revision was released in 2019, which reduced some of the features of the system and its size, including eliminating the ability to dock the unit, making the Switch Lite primarily a handheld system, but otherwise compatible with most of the Switch's library of games. In the 9th generation of home video game consoles, active from 2020 to the present, both Microsoft and Sony released successors to their home consoles in November of 2020. Consoles in this generation also launched with lower cost models, lacking optical disc drives, targeting those who would prefer to purchase games exclusively through digital downloads. Both console families target 4K and 8K resolution televisions at high frame rates, support for real-time ray tracing rendering, 3D spatial audio, variable refresh rates, and the use of high-performance solid-state drives, or SSDs, as internal high-speed memory to make delivering game content much faster than reading from optical disc or standard hard drives, which can eliminate loading times and support in-game streaming. With features that were commonly standard in PCs and the move to higher performance APUs, consoles in the 9th generation now have capabilities comparable to high-end personal computers, often making cross-platform development easier and more widely available than previously, further converging and blurring the line between video game consoles and personal computers. Microsoft released the 4th generation of Xbox with the Xbox Series X and Series S on November 10th, 2020. The Series X was a base performance target of 60 frames per second at 4K resolution to be 4 times as powerful as the Xbox One X. One of Microsoft's goals with both units was to assure backward compatibility with all games supported by the Xbox One, including those original Xbox and Xbox 360 titles that are backward compatible with the Xbox One, allowing the Xbox Series X and S to support 4 generations of games. Sony's PlayStation 5 was released on November 12, 2020, and also is a similar performance boost over the PlayStation 4. The PlayStation 5 uses a custom SSD solution with much higher input-output rates that are most comparable to RAM chip speeds, significantly improving rendering and data streaming speeds. The chip architecture is comparable to that of the PlayStation 4, allowing backwards compatibility with most of the PlayStation 4 library, while select games will need chip timing tweaking to make them compatible.